Monica sat at her desk, staring at the computer screen where rows of numbers from another report flickered. It seemed like an ordinary day in her life, but something felt off. She sensed a strange tension in the air, as if something important was approaching but remained hidden from her sight. She had devoted so many years to this job, where her perseverance and professionalism had saved the team in critical moments more than once. But now, something was gnawing at her inside. A knock on her office door interrupted her thoughts. "Monica, HR wants to talk to you," her boss John said cautiously, avoiding eye contact. His gesture seemed suspicious to her. "All right," she replied, trying to conceal her growing sense of unease. As she stood up from her chair, she felt a slight dizziness, an omen of trouble. Walking down the corridor to the HR office, she tried to calm herself, reminding herself that she had always been valued for her professionalism. However, the feeling that this was not just another conversation about projects intensified. When she entered, she was met by the cold gaze of the HR manager. Without any pleasantries or attempts to soften the situation, he began to speak. "Monica, you're fired. As of today, you're no longer employed with the company." Monica's eyes widened, and the words hit her like a bolt of lightning. She heard the dry formalities, structural changes, new approach, but among the stream of phrases, she caught the main point. They had hired someone else for her position, a white person. Monica tried to hold back. Questions swirled in her mind. Why? How is this possible? I poured my heart and soul into this company. Her usually composed emotional strength began to fade, giving way to anger. In that moment, she realized this wasn't just a structural change. It was an act of discrimination. Monica returned home in complete silence. Inside, a storm of emotions brewed. Anger, pain, and despair filled her chest, pushing out any rational thoughts. She sat in traffic, but even the cars around her and the flashing lights couldn't distract her from her thoughts. Scenes from the past, which she had long tried to ignore, kept resurfacing in her mind. She remembered how her achievements had been constantly overshadowed by the successes of her white colleagues over the years. She had repeatedly had to prove her competence to management, even though her projects had brought the company significant profits. Her opinions were rarely taken seriously at meetings, dominated mainly by men, especially white colleagues who were easily promoted despite her vastly superior qualifications. One memory stood out more vividly than the rest. Last year, a new hire, a white man with minimal experience, was given a leadership role in a project she had been preparing for years. All this time, I thought if I worked harder, I would be recognized. But no. Bitter thoughts pierced her mind. Monica felt her confidence, built over years of hard work, crumble in an instant. The sense of injustice that had been building inside her suddenly broke free. She was tired of her accomplishments being ignored, her talents overshadowed, and her skin color becoming a barrier. But now she decided she wouldn't stay silent. A thought began to form in her mind. I have to do something. This isn't just injustice. This is systemic oppression. When Monica woke up the next morning, the anger that had boiled inside her had transformed into cold determination. She would no longer be a victim. She would not let anyone bring her down. I can't stay silent, she repeated to herself, looking in the mirror as if confirming to herself that she had made the right decision. She grabbed her phone and began searching for contacts of legal organizations specializing in discrimination cases. Deep down, she knew this wouldn't be easy. The system always protected itself, but her inner strength had become her weapon. Do they think they can silence me? I'll show them they're wrong, she thought as she scheduled a meeting with a lawyer. When she entered the law firm, she was greeted by the lawyer she had contacted earlier. His office was quiet, but the tension was palpable. He invited her to sit and began gathering information. Monica told him about her experience, the years of work, how her achievements had been consistently downplayed, and how she was ultimately replaced by a less qualified white employee. The lawyer listened thoughtfully. Your case is challenging, he finally said, but we have a chance. We can fight. It will be a long road, but if you're ready, let's begin. Without hesitation, Monica replied, I'm ready. We have to do this. As she left the office, she felt like the first step had been taken. Now she understood that her fight for justice was only beginning. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but she would not back down. Her voice would become a weapon against the system, and she would no longer be a silent victim of injustice. Monica sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee in her hands, but couldn't bring herself to take a sip. Her mind raced, replaying the events of the past few days. The firing, the conversation with the lawyer, the realization of the injustice. Her thoughts intertwined with memories of how she'd been overlooked at work time and again. She realized her dismissal wasn't just a coincidence, but part of a deeper systemic problem: racism. Today, Monica planned to meet with a few former colleagues to discuss what had happened. Perhaps she wasn't the only one who had faced such discrimination, and she needed evidence for the upcoming case. This thought gave her strength, but despite her determination, she felt anxious. Many colleagues were afraid to speak openly about such things, unwilling to jeopardize their careers. What if they don't want to talk? What if it all ends up being my word against the system? These questions haunted her. As she left home and headed to the meeting, scenes from the office replayed in her mind, her accomplishments, unnoticed, her ideas, stolen and presented by others as their own. Monica felt internal pressure, anger and despair mixed in her chest, creating a sense that she had to change something. This was no longer just a fight for herself, but for others who, like her, had fallen victim to the system, but were afraid to speak up. I won't stay silent anymore, she whispered to herself, like a mantra, before walking into the cafe where her colleagues awaited her. Monica sat at a large wooden table, surrounded by former colleagues. The atmosphere was tense, as if everyone present felt that their conversation carried more weight than just discussing recent events. An awkward silence hung in the air, broken only by the clinking of cups and the murmurs of other cafe patrons. So, what happened? One of her former colleagues, Marcus, finally broke the silence. He had always been close to her, though he hadn't worked directly with her team. We heard you got fired, but why? It clearly wasn't because you were bad at your job. Monica sighed. They replaced me with a less qualified white employee. They didn't even try to hide it behind some pretext. They just said they made a decision and that was it. She felt anger rising again inside her, but tried to keep her composure. Marcus looked at her with understanding. I'm not surprised, honestly. I've seen this happen before, though I don't have proof. You're not the only one. Alexia, a quiet but always observant colleague, suddenly chimed in. Remember when I was passed over for a promotion 2 years ago? It went to someone who didn't even know how to use half the tools I work with daily. And he was white too. Monica felt her suspicions starting to be confirmed. Why did we stay silent all this time? She blurted out. We all endured these injustices, thinking it was only happening to us, that nothing could change. And who would listen to us? Alexia said in despair. We're just individual voices in a huge company. Monica felt the anger building inside her. If we banded together, if we did this collectively, we'd have a chance. She saw the faces around the table gradually change. In her colleagues' eyes, there was a dawning realization. They were no longer alone in this fight. What do you suggest? Marcus finally asked, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and hope. We need to make this public, Monica said confidently. If the company won't listen, the public will. The media, activists, they'll help us. This is our chance to fight for the truth. After the meeting with her colleagues, Monica felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. They had agreed to start gathering evidence and testimonies to bring public attention to the case. She was filled with determination, but she also knew the road ahead would not be easy. The next day, she sat at her computer, preparing a letter to a major news outlet. She reread her words over and over, trying to find the perfect balance between presenting the facts, and eliciting an emotional response. "We're not just victims," she thought. "We are fighters." In the letter, Monica described the systemic neglect of Black employees in the company, their exclusion from decision-making processes, and the unfair distribution of roles. She carefully avoided sounding overly aggressive, but made sure to convey the scale of the problem. She knew that if their story caught the attention of major media, they could expose the systemic discrimination that remained hidden. After sending the letter, she felt a surge of adrenaline. Now it's up to how the public responds, she thought. A few days later, just as Monica was beginning to lose hope, she received a response from the editor. "We're interested in your case. We're ready to publish an article." This news confirmed that her plan had worked, and now the world would see what had previously been kept quiet. She called her colleagues. "We're in," she said briefly. On the other end of the line, there was silence, and then Marcus replied, "This is just the beginning, isn't it?" "Yes," Monica answered, feeling a new hope grow in her heart. Now she knew that her voice, like the voices of others, would no longer go unheard. It had been several weeks since Monica and her colleagues reached out to the media, and it felt like the silence surrounding their case had dragged on too long. Every day, she checked the news, looking for even a hint of interest in their story. Inside her, a mix of impatience and fear grew. What if no one cared? What if they remained unnoticed? She replayed her dismissal in her mind, how easily the company managed to cover up such things. The memories were still fresh. How at first she feared that fighting for justice would label her a problematic employee. Why me? Why is all this happening to me? She thought, sitting at her kitchen table and staring at the glowing screen of her phone. Her internal conflict was palpable. On one hand, she knew she'd made the right move by contacting the media. But on the other hand, the prolonged silence began to sow doubt. What if she was blamed for making too much noise? What if the world simply wasn't ready to hear the truth? But everything changed when, on one gloomy autumn day, her phone exploded with calls. "Monica, have you seen it?" Alexia asked excitedly on the other end of the line. "It's everywhere. Our story is on all the major news portals." Monica rushed to open her laptop, her fingers trembling with excitement. On the screen, the headline flashed. "Systemic discrimination in the tech sector. How one Black IT professional opened the world's eyes." Her name was in the headlines and her story was on the front pages. Her heart raced, a mixture of joy and anxiety. She realized that now, their case would go beyond a personal conflict. It would become a symbol of the fight against systemic racism. But along with this came the understanding that she would now be under intense scrutiny. The story of systemic discrimination at the company where Monica had worked quickly went viral. However, instead of admitting fault, the company's leadership decided to take an aggressive stance. Press releases from the company appeared at a startling pace, all painting Monica in an extremely negative light. "Our company has always valued diversity and equal opportunities," she read in one of the press releases, leaning back in her chair with a sense of disgust. They portrayed her as an employee who created problems within the team and failed to meet expectations, depicting her as an incompetent professional. These words hit her like a wave of anger. "Do they really think they can just accuse me and silence me?" she said out loud. She remembered how, from the beginning, her successes at work were downplayed and her achievements ignored. Now it was happening again, but on a public stage. Marcus, who had become her loyal ally, came to see her that evening, and together they watched as the company launched its campaign against her. "Is this new?" he asked, reading yet another report where she was described as a difficult employee. Monica stayed silent, holding back tears of frustration. "They just don't want to change their system," she finally said. "But now we have the public, and they won't be able to silence us so easily." "They're afraid of us," Marcus added. "You've created a wave, and now they're desperately trying to defend themselves." His voice was supportive, and Monica felt her fears begin to fade. She knew she wasn't alone. For the first time in her life, she had the sense that an entire movement stood behind her. The next day, major news outlets published an article exposing the discriminatory practices at the company. It was a turning point. The stories Monica and her colleagues had shared with journalists were now public, bolstered by testimonies from other employees who had finally found the courage to speak out. Monica sat at home, surrounded by notifications on her phone. Emails and messages poured in one after another, from people sharing their own experiences with similar situations but who had been too afraid to speak up. Words of support and gratitude flowed in, giving her strength. She realized that their story had struck a chord of justice and had become a symbol for many people across the country. Her heart swelled with a sense of justice. She couldn't hold back tears of joy when she learned that several major companies had begun to review their policies on racial discrimination after seeing the scandal unfold. Later that evening, she met with Alexia and Marcus. "You did it," Alexia said, looking at Monica with admiration. "Now everything is different." Monica nodded, her face calm. "We did it together," she corrected her friend. "And this is just the beginning." Now she felt her strength, the kind that wasn't just hers but belonged to a united movement against injustice. Monica sat on the edge of her bed, staring out the window as the evening slowly darkened. She felt that with each new story in the media, with each step she took in her fight for justice, her world began to crumble. Friends who once supported her were now starting to avoid her. They didn't say it outright, but she saw the changes: unanswered messages, missed calls, excuses when she asked to meet. It seemed like they were scared of her active stance, her fight against the system. Even some of her relatives started voicing their disapproval. "Why are you doing this?" she heard at family gatherings. "You're not going to change anything. You're just ruining your life." Monica sighed deeply, feeling a wave of loneliness wash over her. What had started as an attempt to deal with workplace injustice was now becoming something much bigger. But the more she tried, the more isolated she felt. She couldn't understand why the people who had known her all her life were now so distant. After all, she was only fighting for justice. An inner conflict tore at her. She knew that her actions might cost her not only her career, but also her personal relationships. Was it worth it? "I've lost so much, but what do I have to show for it? Nothing has changed yet," she thought, feeling the exhaustion and anxiety growing with each passing day. But on the other hand, she knew that if she stopped now, everything she had fought for would be in vain. "I can't stop. If I give up, what will happen next?" she whispered to herself, feeling a mixture of anger and doubt rise inside her. The next day, Monica met Marcus at a small cafe. She had been looking forward to this meeting, hoping to talk about what had been happening to her lately. Marcus had always been a reliable friend, someone who had supported her from the very beginning of her fight. But even with him, it was hard to share the deep fears and doubts that had been plaguing her lately. "You look tired," Marcus noted, studying her face. His eyes were filled with concern. Monica sighed, looking at him with regret. I'm starting to doubt whether it's worth continuing," she confessed. "Every day seems harder. People are avoiding me. Friends, family, even those close to me have started to distance themselves." Marcus frowned, setting his coffee cup down on the table. "You know this was inevitable, Monica. Fighting the system always scares those around you. People prefer not to see the truth because it makes them uncomfortable. They're afraid of being in your position. But why do I have to pay such a high price just for speaking the truth?" she snapped, feeling the anger rise in her. "Why do I have to lose everything for this?" Marcus looked at her with sympathy, but his voice was firm. "Because you're going up against a system that doesn't want to change. This fight always demands sacrifices." Monica lowered her eyes, not knowing how to respond. Marcus's words hit her where it hurt most. She knew he was right, but it was hard to accept that she had to lose everything dear to her for the sake of justice. "But is that fair?" she whispered softly. Marcus was silent for a moment before quietly, but confidently saying, "No, Monica, it's not fair. But you're doing this not just for yourself. You're fighting for everyone who's been in the same position but couldn't or didn't dare raise their voice." Those words awakened something inside her. She had always thought of her fight as personal, but now she began to realize that her actions carried much greater weight. Monica woke up the next morning with a new sense of determination. The conversation with Marcus had reignited the flame that had almost been extinguished in recent days. She could no longer afford to doubt. Her fight was bigger than herself. It wasn't just about her right to justice, but about the right of everyone who had been oppressed by the system. Sitting at her desk, she began to formulate a new plan of action. Her thoughts were clearer than ever before. If I only fight for myself, it won't lead to lasting results, she thought. But if I can unite others, we can change more than just one company. We can change the entire system. She picked up the phone and called several colleagues who had previously supported her. The conversations gave her a new surge of energy. "We're all in the same boat," they told her. Monica felt that now she wasn't alone. This was a collective struggle. Later that evening, she met with Marcus again. His smile immediately told her he was proud of her renewed determination. "Are you ready?" he asked, looking into her eyes. Monica nodded, feeling a wave of inner strength. "I'm ready. Now I understand that my fight is something bigger. It's a path to equality for all of us." She knew there would be many challenges ahead. She understood that even greater sacrifices awaited her. But now she was sure of one thing. She wouldn't stop until real change was achieved. For herself, for others, for future generations. Monica sat in her apartment, surrounded by the silence that seemed to weigh heavily on her. Every sound, every whisper of movement intensified the tension inside her. Thoughts raced through her mind, reflecting the inner battle raging within her. She knew the time had come to take the next step, filing a lawsuit against the company. This decision had been brewing inside her for a long time, but with each passing day, more questions made her doubt. What if it's all for nothing? What if she lost? But deep down, she knew she had to see it through to the end. Filing the lawsuit wasn't just her right. It was an act of defiance. "I can't let them get away with this," Monica thought as she carefully considered each step, each potential obstacle. At that moment, she realized she was fighting not only for herself, but for everyone who had faced discrimination, but hadn't dared to raise their voice. Her phone rang, and Monica answered. It was her lawyer confirming that they could begin the process. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, his voice quiet but confidently steady. "Yes, I'm ready," Monica replied, her voice firm, though inside, a storm raged. She knew the lawsuit against the company would trigger a wave of criticism. Many of her former colleagues and friends had already openly expressed their disagreement with her actions. They said it was foolish, that nothing would change. But Monica knew she had to fight. It was her internal conviction, her unwavering belief in justice. "I won't back down anymore," she repeated to herself like a mantra. When Monica arrived at her lawyer's office, she felt a mix of emotions. On one hand, fear of the inevitable confrontation with the company that had been her workplace for so many years. On the other hand, a determination to move forward, even if it meant facing new difficulties. The lawyer was already waiting for her at the table with a pile of papers and documents. "We've begun gathering the necessary evidence," he said, showing her a list of witnesses and documents that could support her case. "We have several colleagues who are willing to testify on your behalf." Monica nodded, listening attentively. She understood that each witness was important, but her heart ached at the thought that many of them had to risk their careers for the truth. Still, not everyone was ready to stand by her side. "But," the lawyer continued, "some of your former colleagues have already stated that they'll testify against you. They claim that you were always a problematic employee and that you're making false accusations to gain an advantage." Those words hit Monica like a bolt of lightning. She knew it wouldn't be easy for everyone to speak the truth, but she hadn't expected anyone to go so far as to protect the company at the expense of her reputation. They're protecting the system for their own gain, she thought bitterly, willing to sell the truth for the chance to keep their jobs. They're afraid, the lawyer said as if reading her thoughts. Afraid of losing their jobs, afraid of change. It's a standard reaction. We need to be prepared for them to fight. I know, Monica quietly replied, clenching her fists under the table. But that won't stop me. The first day in court felt like the calm before a storm, tense and filled with anticipation. Monica sat in the courtroom, feeling her heart pounding in her chest. She repeatedly rehearsed in her mind what she might say, how she would respond to the inevitable accusations. But the most daunting thing was that today, she would face those who had once been her colleagues but were now testifying against her. When the company's first witness began speaking, Monica felt a wave of anger and disappointment crash over her. It was one of her former colleagues who had once called her a friend. But now he spoke about her as if she were a stranger. She was always a problem, he said. She tried to create conflicts at work and her dismissal was inevitable. Every word was like a stab in the heart. Monica struggled to maintain her composure even though inside, everything was boiling. How can they do this? She thought, looking at the person sitting across from her. They know the truth. They witnessed how I fought for fairness at work. Her lawyer, noticing the tension on her face, leaned over and whispered, "Don't let them get to you. This is their tactic. We're here for the truth." Those words were like a cold shower, bringing her back to reality. Monica took a deep breath and felt her anger gradually give way to determination. She understood that people would defend the system for their own gain. But that wouldn't change her goal. She was here for the truth, and she intended to fight to the end. When the court adjourned for the day, Monica stepped outside and breathed in the fresh air. Her legs felt heavy, but inside, she felt a newfound strength. Her battle had only begun, and she knew there were still many challenges ahead. But that day had shown her the most important thing. She was ready for anything. The trial had been going on for several weeks now, and Monica felt like the world around her was slowly changing. She looked at her phone, where new articles and reports on her story appeared every day. The media, which had previously ignored her efforts, were now competing to cover discrimination in the tech industry. This sudden interest was like a strong wind, pulling Monica out of her usual routine. Her story spread like wildfire. Each new headline was like a breath of fresh air, giving her hope that her fight had meaning. But with that came pressure. Monica increasingly thought about how her life was now under constant scrutiny. Every step she took, every word she said, was being evaluated. And this began to weigh on her. She sat in her small office, surrounded by a stack of newspapers with headlines screaming about her case. Black woman versus corporate giant. Monica's story changes the rules of the industry. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel invisible, but this new status as a public figure turned out to be unexpectedly heavy. "Are you ready for this?" Marcus asked when they met at the cafe again. "You're not just a person fighting for her rights anymore. You've become a symbol of the fight against the system. It's a big responsibility." Monica nodded, but inside, doubts grew. "I just wanted to restore justice for myself," she whispered. "But now it feels like this story has become something much bigger." "And that's a good thing," Marcus said confidently. "It means your fight matters. You've given a voice to those who never had one." Monica understood that he was right, but the fear still smoldered inside her. The fear that she might not be able to handle the role she had been forced to take on. The more the media covered her story, the stronger the pressure on the company she was suing became. The corporation began losing clients, its stock prices started to fall, and the public actively condemned its practices. For the first time in a long while, Monica saw the real consequences of her actions. But with that came new challenges. The company didn't just sit back. its management launched a counterattack. They issued press releases denying all accusations and even tried to paint Monica in a negative light, calling her actions an attempt to profit off the company's reputation. This tactic was expected, but it still hit her hard. She knew they would fight to the end, but she hadn't thought they would once again try to label her as a problematic employee. "They won't stop," her lawyer said as they discussed the company's response. "But we need to hold on. We have enough evidence, and public opinion is already on our side." Monica felt the weight of it again. On one hand, she saw that her fight was bearing fruit. The corporation was suffering losses, and people were beginning to talk about racial discrimination in the IT industry. But on the other hand, the personal attacks made her feel vulnerable. "How long can I hold up under this?" she asked Marcus one evening after work. They sat in her apartment, and he could see the exhaustion in her eyes. "You're stronger than you think," he replied. "You've already gone through so much. This is just another test." Monica looked at him, trying to find the resolve that had been driving her all this time. She realized that now her fight wasn't just about her. It had become a fight for everyone who, like her, faced discrimination. "I can't give up," she said, almost convincing herself. A few days after the latest wave of media attention, Monica received a letter from a well-known company expressing support for her case and inviting her to speak at a conference on racial justice in business. For the first time in her career, she wasn't being seen as a victim, but as a leader whose opinion mattered and was sought after. When she read the invitation, something stirred in her chest. It was something she had never expected: recognition of her efforts. She thought back to all the moments when she had been ignored at work, when her voice hadn't been heard. Now she was on the verge of being heard by thousands. She picked up the phone and called Marcus. "You won't believe what happened," she said, her voice filled with excitement. "Something good, I hope?" he replied with a smile in his voice. "I was invited to a conference. They want me to give a speech on racial discrimination in business." Monica could hardly believe her own words. "It's so strange. I feel like I'm standing on a new threshold. Before, I just wanted to protect myself. But now I'm leading a movement." Marcus was silent for a few seconds before responding. "You deserve this, Monica. Your actions have shown the world that the fight for justice isn't in vain. Now you can help others. Be an example for them." Those words touched her deeply. She realized that her story was no longer just her own. It had become a symbol of the fight for equality. And although this path had been full of pain, she knew she had made the right choice. When Monica stood in front of the mirror preparing for the conference, she saw more than just a woman who had faced discrimination. She saw someone ready to take responsibility for the future. Her story had become more than just her personal struggle. It had become a movement that was helping to change the system. Monica sat in her home, listening to the silence that now felt heavy and suffocating. The past few weeks had been full of struggles, both professionally and personally. She had received countless messages of support. Her story had spread across the internet, and activists and human rights organizations had taken to the streets, protesting racial discrimination in the tech industry. It seemed that her efforts were finally bearing fruit. But with each passing day, more and more troubling news reached her. Threats. At first, they were anonymous letters accusing her of ruining the company's reputation, claiming she was just after money. Then the phone calls began. The voices on the other end were cold and hostile. "You don't know what you're getting into," they warned. "You better stop before it's too late." Monica tried to keep herself composed, but fear slowly crept into her soul. She sat in her kitchen, holding her phone, reading yet another threatening message. Her heart tightened with terror. What if they go beyond words? This thought haunted her. Every sound outside the window seemed like a potential danger, every shadow moving on the wall a signal of a looming threat. Her gaze fell on the photo of her son, sitting on the shelf. The fear became even more unbearable when she thought of him. She couldn't allow her fight for justice to endanger his life. "But if I stop now, what will that achieve?" she said aloud, as if trying to convince herself. "They want me to be scared. Fear is their weapon. But I can't let them win." Deep down, she knew. If she backed down now, everything she had fought for would be in vain. The next day, Monica met with Marcus at their usual cafe to discuss recent events. She told him about the threats, and worry flashed across his face. "You know they could be dangerous," he said once she finished. "I know," Monica replied, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. "But I can't just stop. They're using fear to silence me. But if I give up, who will be left to fight for justice?" Marcus sighed, lowering his eyes to his coffee cup. He understood her, but, as her friend, he was concerned for her safety. "Monica, I'm not asking you to give up. But you have to be careful. These people aren't just making empty threats. They might do something real." Monica was silent for a few seconds, realizing he was right. The fear was so real that it overshadowed everything else. But in that moment, she understood. Fear was what her enemies used as a weapon to break her will. "I know," she said quietly. "But if I give up now, fear will win, and they'll know they can scare anyone who tries to raise their voice. I won't let them win." Her voice grew stronger, and Marcus noticed the change. "You're strong, Monica, but please be careful." Monica nodded, promising herself that she would be as cautious as possible, but there was no room in her heart for retreat. She knew her fight was about more than just her personal safety. It was a movement for truth and justice, for equality. A few days later, Monica made a decision. She needed to make a public statement. She knew that the threats she was facing were attempts to make her back down, but now she decided to respond to them openly. She prepared a statement for social media, knowing that her voice would be heard by thousands. That day, her account was viewed by millions, and support from across the country lifted her spirits. "I am not afraid," she wrote in her post. "They have tried to intimidate me, but fear is a temporary feeling, while the fight for truth is an eternal value. I will not stop until justice is restored. We cannot afford to retreat in the face of injustice." Her post sparked a wave of reactions. A new surge of support began on social media. People shared her words, admiring her courage. Monica suddenly realized that she wasn't alone in this fight. Her voice had become part of a larger movement, one that united people across the country. She looked at her phone screen, at the thousands of comments filled with support and gratitude. Her heart swelled with new strength. Now she knew. Her story no longer belonged only to her. She had become part of something bigger. "You did it," Marcus said when they met later. "You showed them that they can't break you." Monica smiled. "This isn't just my fight anymore," she replied. "Now I understand that fear is their weapon, but we have something stronger: truth." Monica sat on the couch in the living room, holding a book she had been trying to read for the past half hour. But thoughts of work, the court case, and public pressure wouldn't let her focus on the text. She glanced at her son, playing with toy cars on the rug. His carefree play sharply contrasted with the world in which Monica was forced to fight for justice. He looked up at her, suddenly pausing in his game. "Mom, why do they keep showing you on TV?" he asked with childlike innocence. The question caught Monica off guard. Her son was still too young to fully understand what was happening, but he had already noticed the changes. There was a purity and innocence in his words, but hidden within them was fear. The fear that his mother had become the center of attention in a world he didn't yet fully understand. Monica sighed, trying to find the words to explain without frightening him. "I'm defending my rights because someone hurt me and treated me unfairly," she began, trying to speak softly but with an understanding of the seriousness of the situation. "I want everyone to know that it's wrong to judge people by how they look." Her son froze for a moment, thinking over her words. "Did they hurt you because you Because you're black? He asked, his voice trembling slightly with worry. Monica felt a tightness in her chest. In that moment, she realized that her son had already begun to face the reality of the world they lived in. She nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. Yes, but I'm fighting to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. And so that you, my dear, don't have to face this when you grow up. The next day, Monica continued reflecting on the conversation with her son. The questions he had asked stayed with her. It seemed to her that, in his eyes, she had become more than just a mother. She was now someone who had to set an example for him, a symbol of strength and justice. In her soul, an inner struggle brewed between wanting to protect her son from the harsh realities of the world and the need to be completely honest with him. In the evening, as they sat in the kitchen preparing dinner, her son spoke up again. "Mom, why can't people just live peacefully? Why do some people think they're better than others?" Monica felt her heart clench at his words. She set the pot on the stove and slowly turned to him. These questions were so simple, yet they touched on the very essence of the fight she faced every day. "It's hard to explain, honey," she began. "Some people are afraid of what they don't understand. They don't realize that we're all different. But that doesn't make us better or worse. And they make mistakes by judging others based on the color of their skin or how they look." Her son looked at her with big, sincere eyes. "But that's wrong, right? They shouldn't do that." Monica leaned down to him, placing her hands on his shoulders. "You're right. It's wrong. And that's why I'm fighting. I want you to live in a world where no one will judge you by how you look, where everyone is treated equally and fairly." These words deeply resonated within her. She realized that her fight wasn't just about her anymore. It was about her son's future and the world he would grow up in. She had to keep going, despite all the fears and threats surrounding her. Late at night, after her son had fallen asleep, Monica sat by his bed, watching his peaceful face. He looked so vulnerable, yet his innocence gave her strength. Recalling their conversations, she knew she had to make a promise. Not just to him, but to herself. "I promise I will fight for you," she whispered, gently tucking the blanket around his small body. "I will do everything in my power to make this world a better place for you and for all the children growing up in it, so that you never have to face what I'm dealing with now." She felt a new flame of determination ignite in her chest. Monica knew that many challenges lay ahead, that the fight for justice was never easy. But now she felt a responsibility not only to herself and her colleagues, but also to her son and his future. This thought gave her strength. She was no longer alone in this fight. She was fighting for the next generation, for a world where they would live in fairness and equality. Monica stood in front of the mirror in her bedroom, staring at her reflection. Her eyes were full of tension, her face serious and slightly tired. She knew well that today could be the decisive day. The final stage of the court case, which had been dragging on for months, had arrived, and she had to make her final statement. Thoughts swirled in her mind. How to structure the speech so she would be heard. How to maintain her composure despite the accumulated fatigue and constant pressure. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. But alongside this, a growing anxiety filled her chest. What if it had all been for nothing? What if the court ruled against her? This thought made her heart tighten with fear. Her battle had gone far beyond one company. She had become the symbol of something bigger, but Monica understood that even symbols sometimes fall. "Mom, you look beautiful," her son said, appearing at the door. He looked at her with love and admiration, as if he saw a hero. It was exactly what she needed at that moment, a reminder of why she had started this journey. She hugged him, feeling his warmth, and found peace. "Thank you, sweetheart," she whispered. "Today is a very important day." She knew she couldn't let down herself or those who believed in her. Her son, her legal team, the activists, and all the people who had followed her story. They were all waiting for justice. And today, she had to take the final step on this long journey. Monica entered the courtroom, feeling the tension in the air, almost palpable. All eyes were on her: journalists, members of the public, colleagues, and former coworkers. Everyone awaited the culmination of the case. She felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders, but along with it came a new sense of determination. This was her moment. Her lawyer, Julia, approached and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Are you ready?" she asked. Monica nodded. Inside her, a storm of emotions raged, but she knew this was more than just her personal battle. This was the voice of all those who had ever faced discrimination but had no opportunity to fight for their rights. The corporation's side presented their case first. Their lawyer spoke confidently, waving papers, repeating the same old arguments: that Monica's dismissal was based on performance, that she allegedly didn't meet the company's standards. Monica listened to these words, knowing they were lies, but also understanding she had to confront them. When it was her turn to speak, her heart raced faster. She stood up and slowly approached the podium. The courtroom fell silent. "I'm not standing here for myself," she began, trying to speak clearly and confidently. "My story is the story of thousands of others who face discrimination in the workplace every day. I'm fighting not just for my own justice, but for those who may never find the strength to raise their voices." Her words echoed like the tolling of a bell, resonating in the hearts of everyone present. She told her story: how her achievements were ignored, how she was constantly underestimated simply because she was a Black woman in a world ruled by bias and stereotypes. Her voice trembled with emotion, but she didn't allow herself to break down. When Monica finished her speech, the room filled with approving murmurs. People stood up and began to applaud. She stood at the podium, feeling tears rolling down her cheeks. But these weren't tears of pain or fear. They were tears of relief and recognition. She knew that, regardless of the outcome, her voice had been heard. The judge announced a recess to make a decision, and Monica returned to her seat. Her lawyer hugged her and whispered, "You did it. No matter what the court decides, you've already won." These words sank deep into her heart and gave her a sense of deep satisfaction. The waiting was agonizing. Thoughts raced through Monica's mind about what would come next. She knew that her life had changed forever. Even if the court didn't rule in her favor, her fight had already touched the hearts and minds of people. She remembered her son's words and understood. She wasn't just fighting for herself, but for the future. For a world where her son would never face the injustice she had encountered. When the judge returned and began reading the verdict, the silence filled the room once more. Monica sat with her hands clenched, trying to remain calm, though her heart pounded. The verdict was in her favor. Monica closed her eyes, momentarily immersing herself in the feeling of liberation. She knew her journey wasn't over, that new battles lay ahead. But for now, she felt victorious. Her story had become a symbol of the fight for equality and justice, and now she knew that her voice had made a meaningful impact on the world. Monica sat in her seat in the courtroom, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on her, as if every breath was a struggle. In that moment, time seemed to stand still. The judge was about to announce the verdict that would determine the outcome of her months-long battle, and possibly her entire life. Throughout all of this, she had been fighting a system that seemed unshakable. Every time she faced prejudice, her efforts felt like a drop in the ocean. But today, that drop might become a tidal wave. The courtroom was packed with journalists, activists, and members of the public. All eyes were on her, the woman who had become a symbol of the fight for justice and equality. Monica could feel their expectations, their hopes for victory, but she also understood that the opposite could happen. Her hands trembled slightly, but inside, there was no fear, only the desire for truth to finally prevail. She glanced at her lawyer, sitting next to her. Julia nodded at her in reassurance, as if to say, "We've done everything we could." These words, spoken without sound, gave Monica strength. She recalled all her arguments, all the evidence of discrimination, all the attempts by her opponents to paint her in a negative light. But she knew one thing. The truth was on her side. "Monica," she said to herself, gathering her thoughts. "Whatever happens, you've already taken the first step." In that moment, she realized that the fight for justice didn't end in court. The trial was only one step on the path to real change. The judge began to read the verdict, and the room fell into a tense silence. Every word of the judge resonated in Monica's mind like the tolling of a bell. She clenched her hands into fists, feeling everything inside her come to a halt. "The court finds that the facts of discrimination have been proven." When those words were spoken, she felt a wave of relief, but at the same time, an unexpected sadness washed over her. Yes, she had won. The corporation, which had believed it could dismiss her with impunity and hide its biased methods, was found guilty. They were ordered to pay her damages for emotional distress and wrongful termination. It was a victory, but Monica knew that this was only a small part of what she had been fighting for. What did this compensation really mean in the grand scheme of things? She looked at the reactions in the room. Applause, nods of approval, smiles from activists and colleagues who had come to support her. But Monica couldn't fully share in their joy. Inside, she felt that this moment was not an ending, but the beginning of something bigger. When the judge finished speaking and the room was filled with journalists eager to interview her, Monica felt empty. She had won the battle, but what about the war? How many more people around the world were still suffering from discrimination without the means to fight back? This was just one victory in a long and difficult journey. Her lawyer approached and, smiling, said, "You did it, Monica. Now everything will be different." "I know," she replied quietly, "but there's still a long way to go. This victory is only the beginning." After the verdict, Monica left the courtroom, surrounded by journalists and activists. They asked questions, took photos, and sought comments about her feelings and future plans. She felt like they were looking at her as a symbol, as someone who had changed something in society. But inside, she had a clear understanding. The fight for equality and justice was just beginning. "How do you feel after the victory?" one of the reporters asked. Monica stopped, looking at the journalist who waited for her response. She knew that whatever she said at that moment would be heard by millions. "This victory is important not just for me," she began, trying to hold back her emotions. "It's a victory for all those who have faced injustice but didn't know how or couldn't fight back. But I want to say that this battle is just one of many. We can't stop here. Systemic discrimination still exists, and my story is just one example of what needs to change." Her voice was firm and confident. She realized that now she had to channel her efforts into something bigger, to make sure cases like hers wouldn't happen again. Her fight had to become a movement for change, to dismantle outdated and biased views in society. When the crowd of journalists finally pulled back, Monica sat in her car and took a deep breath. Now she knew her journey was just beginning. She was no longer a victim of the system. Now she was its challenger, someone ready to continue fighting not for compensation or personal justice, but for systemic changes that could reshape the future. "I won't stop," she whispered, looking at the sunset outside the window. "I'll keep fighting for all those who can't raise their voices." Several weeks had passed since Monica won her case. Her life had started to change. Every morning she woke up with a lightness she hadn't felt in years. But with that sense of relief came new responsibilities. After her victory, she began receiving offers. Companies that had once been closed to her now opened their doors, inviting her to work. But Monica felt that returning to the familiar professional world wasn't enough anymore. She sat in her kitchen with a cup of coffee, looking out the window. It was an ordinary day outside, but inside her mind was full of thoughts about what to do next. The court victory didn't mean the end of the struggle. She knew her story had impacted society, and she felt this was only the first step. Now she had to decide how to use this new status and the attention she had garnered. Her phone buzzed. It was an invitation to a television interview. They wanted her not just as the woman who had won a landmark case, but as a public leader. Just a few months ago, Monica could never have imagined herself in such a position. But now, this offer reminded her that her story had grown into something much larger. She understood that if she agreed to the interview, she would have to speak not only about herself, but also about issues that affected many others. I can use this platform for something bigger, she thought, feeling a surge of strength. But with that decision came pressure, the responsibility of how her words might influence others. When the day of the interview arrived, Monica felt both excited and nervous. She sat in the makeup room, preparing to go on air. All of this was new to her, the bright lights, the cameras, the production crew. Her heart was racing, though outwardly she tried to maintain composure. She knew millions of people would be watching, and her words could serve as a catalyst for further change. "Are you ready?" asked the producer, peeking into the room. Monica nodded, though inside she still felt uncertainty. As she stepped onto the set and sat down in front of the host, the audience fell silent in anticipation. The cameras started rolling and the smiling host began asking questions. "Monica, you won a significant case that captured the nation's attention. What do you feel now, having gone through all these challenges?" Monica paused for a moment, searching for the right words. "I feel relieved, but I also understand that this is only the beginning. My case isn't just the story of one woman. It's an example of what many people face every day. I know my fight isn't over. Now, I want to help others who are also facing discrimination but don't have a voice." Her voice was steady. She spoke about the importance of knowing your rights, about the need to speak up against injustice. Every word she uttered was filled with sincerity, and she saw how the audience responded to her story. After the interview, she felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She realized that now, her words had the power to change the lives of others. When the interview ended, producers and crew members thanked her for her honesty and bravery. Monica realized that she had become a symbol for many. After the interview, Monica couldn't shake an idea that had been forming in her mind. She remembered how hard it had been to gain recognition and justice in her work as a Black woman in the tech industry. This pushed her toward the decision to create something bigger, a platform to support people like her who face discrimination and inequality in the tech field. She gathered her friends, colleagues, and activists to discuss her idea of creating an initiative to support Black professionals in tech. Her plan was not only to help people find jobs, but also to break down stereotypes and promote a culture of equality in companies. "We need to create a support system," she said at the meeting, "so that those who face discrimination know they are not alone." Monica stood backstage in a large hall, feeling both nervous and confident. Her heart was racing, but not from fear, rather from the awareness of the moment's importance. Several hundred people had gathered in the hall to hear her story. Today, she was about to speak at a forum dedicated to fighting racial discrimination in business and technology. This wasn't just a public speech. It was a new chapter in her life. She looked back, reflecting on how it all began. Her journey had been long and difficult, full of doubts, fear, and pain. But now, standing at the threshold of a new phase, she felt that all her efforts had not been in vain. Her story had gone beyond personal struggle and was now inspiring others. "Are you ready?" Marcus's voice pulled her out of her thoughts. He stood next to her, as always, with a supportive smile. Monica nodded, though inside she still felt a slight nervousness. "Yes, I think I'm ready," she said, straightening her back and taking a deep breath. "This is more than just my story. It's about everyone who has ever faced injustice." Marcus placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're doing something great, Monica. Today, you'll show everyone that change is possible." With those words, she walked toward the stage, feeling a new strength within her. She understood that today, she wasn't just speaking for herself, but also for those who had remained silent in fear of discrimination. This was her time. Monica stood before the vast audience, illuminated by bright spotlights. For the first few moments, she carefully looked at the faces in the crowd, trying to read their expressions. These people hadn't just come to hear the story of her victory. They had come for truth, for strength, for inspiration. "Good afternoon," she began, making sure her voice was firm. She paused, allowing the audience to focus. "Today, I am here to tell you my story. It is the story of how I, an ordinary Black woman, confronted a system that had long turned a blind eye to discrimination. But this isn't just my story. It's the story of thousands of people who face racism and injustice every day." Monica shared how she had been fired, how she fought for justice in court, and how the public began to respond to her struggle. She opened up about her thoughts, fears, and the moments when she wanted to give up. But she emphasized that every step had been part of something bigger. Her voice grew stronger with each minute as she spoke about how racial discrimination was not a problem of one person or one company. It was a systemic issue that needed to be addressed collectively. She noticed how the audience fell into silence, absorbing her words. Her speech was more than just a recounting of personal battles. She spoke about how each of them could make a difference, how collective action held power. When she finished, the audience erupted in applause. But these weren't just formal ovations. Monica could see that her words had touched something deep inside each person present. Her story had found a place in their hearts. After the speech, Monica was surrounded by people. They came up to her to thank her for her words, sharing their own stories, telling her how they too had faced injustice but didn't know how to fight it. Monica saw in their eyes what she had felt herself: hope. Hope that change was possible. A young man approached her, tears in his eyes. "I'm a Black programmer," he said, his voice shaking. "All my life I've dreamed of working in IT, but I constantly face not being taken seriously. Your speech gave me the strength to keep going." These words deeply moved Monica. She realized that her story was truly inspiring people not to give up, but to keep fighting for their rights. But with that realization came the understanding that her work was just beginning. At the end of the forum, representatives from several major companies and activist organizations approached her. They proposed joining forces to create initiatives to support Black professionals in IT. Monica felt that her personal battle was transforming into something greater, a movement for equality and justice. As the evening drew to a close, Monica stood alone in the hall, gazing at the empty chairs. A sense of fulfillment and pride washed over her. But she also understood that the path to dismantling systemic discrimination had only just begun. "I'm ready," she whispered to herself, knowing that much work lay ahead.